He didn't have time to think, he just ran into the fire, and when he came out, he wasn't alone anymore. No one knew who he was. Not the girls he saved, not the woman in the black car who came looking for them. She had everything money could buy, except the one thing he gave her, a second chance to be a mother. They stayed for a night, then another, and before they knew it, they weren't strangers anymore. Not every fire destroys. Some bring you exactly where you're meant to belong. If stories like this stay in your heart, stay a while. Longer, and don't forget to subscribe. The night he ran into the fire wasn't the end of his story, because sometimes, home begins in the moment you choose to stay. Jack Whitaker wasn't looking for miracles that day. He was just trying to beat the rain. The sky above the hills of Winford Hollow had been brooding all afternoon, thick with gray, and the kind of tension that made old men check their knees and farmers rush their chores. Jack's truck, dented and faithful, rumbled over the winding two-lane highway that curved between ridges of gold-leafed trees, the engine humming like an old hymn. He had just loaded a shipment of salvaged wood into the back. Oak boards from a barn older than sin, perfect for the porch repairs he'd promised the Thompsons, and was thinking about stew. Not metaphors, not memories. Just stew, maybe with cornbread if he still had milk. But then came the smoke. Not chimney smoke or autumn. Burn piles. This was black and urgent, thick as war. It curled into the sky from a gully just beyond mile marker 17, where the road dipped sharply past an overgrown clearing. Jack's stomach sank before he even saw the flames. He pulled over. Gravel, crunching under his tires, boots on the ground before the engine fully stopped. The smell hit first. Rubber, oil, something acrid and deeply wrong. Then he heard the screaming. It was a school bus. Yellow paint warped from the heat. One side crumpled against a tree. The front windshield cracked like a spiderweb. Flames licked. Through the middle, smoke gushing from the roof like a warning too late. And then, small fists banging on the back window. Jack ran. Years ago, this would have been second nature. Before the station closed. Before the fire that left him with a grafted shoulder and a little girl's room preserved in ash. But instincts don't vanish. They wait in your bones. He tore open the back hatch, miraculously unjammed, and saw them. 2 girls, matching braids, matching wide eyes, twins, no more than 5, one of them coughing, the other clinging to a stuffed rabbit. "Come on," Jack barked, hoarse but steady. "Give me your hands." One hesitated. The other didn't. He pulled them both through as the ceiling above groaned and a tire exploded somewhere in the front. He didn't look back. Just ran, one child under each arm, his burned shoulder screaming with the memory of pain. They reached the roadside just as a passerby skidded to a stop and called for help. The sirens came minutes later, long enough for Jack to wrap both girls in a flannel jacket and press their trembling forms against his chest. "You're okay now," he murmured, mostly to himself. At the emergency station in town, nurses tried coaxing the girls out of Jack's lap. They wouldn't go. Not even for juice. Not even for the teddy bears. "They've imprinted on you," one of the volunteers whispered with a sad smile. Not sure what to do about that, Jack didn't answer. His shoulder throbbed. Smoke still clung to his beard. But when one of the twins, he didn't know which, looked up at him with wet, shaking lashes and whispered, "Uncle Jack?" Something cracked open in his chest like thawing ground. He stayed until they were settled. Until the social worker arrived. Until they had clean blankets and were nodding off against each other in a quiet side room. Then, without a word, he left. It was nearly dark when Jack returned to the house. His cabin sat tucked into the trees on the west edge of town, past the mill road where leaves gathered like secrets in the ditch. The porch light flickered as he pulled up. The front step still leaned to the left. He'd been meaning to fix it. He lit the fireplace, reheated the stew, stared at the untouched bowl across the table, the one that always seemed to sit there, out of habit more than use. He didn't tell anyone what happened, didn't want the town fuss, didn't want the praise. And besides, it wasn't about him. The knock came as the first drops of rain hit the roof. 3 short taps. Hesitant. Not the sheriff, not the mayor, too gentle for that. Jack opened the door, and time slowed. She stood there, soaked to the bone, the hood of her black wool coat dripping with rain, a fine leather purse clutched tightly to her side. Her hair clung to her cheeks. Her eyes, sharp gray, storm-lit, scanned him with a desperation that had no pride left to protect it. Behind her, a sleek black Rolls-Royce idled on the muddy path, headlights aglow in the mist, out of place in every possible way. "I was told," she said, her voice quiet, cultured, trembling, "that you brought them out. From the bus." Jack said nothing. The rain ticked on the roof above them. One of the twins, her daughter, had left a small pink ribbon on his workbench, now wet from the draft near the window. "They're safe," he said finally. A breath escaped, her more exhale than sound. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself. "I'm Elise," she whispered. "I know who you are," Jack said softly. He stepped aside, rain pooling at his boots. "You should come in. You're cold." The fire had gone out hours ago, but Jack still felt its heat behind his ribs. He sat on the edge of the armchair, fingers laced loosely between his knees, watching the woman move around his cabin like someone stepping into the past. Elise hadn't spoken much since she crossed the threshold, except to ask, twice, if her daughters were really safe. He'd nodded both times. They were upstairs now, asleep on his old twin bed, curled into each other under a handmade quilt. Jack had found it in the cedar chest after Elise arrived. White and faded blue, stitched by someone who believed comfort lived in fabric. He remembered the way Elise had stood in the doorway when he led her to them, silent, not reaching, just staring at her girls like she couldn't trust her eyes. And then, like something snapped back into place, she had dropped to her knees, arms open. No fanfare, no tears, just a quiet collapse into something whole again. Jack hadn't stayed in the room. It was too private, too full of things he wasn't sure belonged to him. Now in the firelight he could hear her upstairs, light footsteps, the soft creak of old floorboards, as she checked on them again and again. She returned minutes later, her coat now drying near the stove, her wet hair combed back and clipped in a way that framed her face like a portrait he didn't mean to admire. "I don't think they've let go of each other since I lost them," she said, her voice low. Jack nodded. "They held on to me the same way." She sat on the edge of the dining bench just beneath the window, where the rain streaked against the glass. Outside, the woods whispered with wind and dripping leaves. "I owe you more than I can say." "No, you don't." "I do," she insisted. "You went into that fire. For them. For children you didn't know." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and walked to the counter, poured a second mug of tea, and handed it to her. Her hands brushed his, cool, delicate, trembling just a little, and she looked up at him with something he couldn't name. Not gratitude, not admiration, something lonelier than both. He sat back down. "I didn't think," Jack finally said. "I just saw them in the window and you moved." "Yeah." They sat in the silence that followed, not awkward, but heavy, honest. "I didn't know who to call," Elise said suddenly. "My family isn't really in the picture, and their father." She trailed off, jaw tightening. "He's not someone I trust." Jack looked at her then, not just at the face, a beautiful one, too sharp to be soft, too soft to be cruel, but at the edge of her voice, the space where control cracked and truth threatened. "I didn't ask," he said gently, "and I won't." Elise let out a quiet breath. "I appreciate that." Time moved strangely in the cabin that night. The rain came harder, then softer. The kettle whistled. Jack fixed the hinge on the pantry door just to give his hands something to do. Elise sat in silence, occasionally sipping the tea, occasionally pressing her palm flat against her chest like trying to quiet something inside. At one point she turned toward him and asked, "Do you have kids?" Jack stilled, his fingers wrapped around the mug a little tighter. I did, he said, the words grating like sandpaper. A daughter. She was 6 when we lost her. House fire. I'm so sorry. Jack gave a nod that didn't reach his eyes. Long time ago, but not really. No, Elise whispered. It never really is. Their eyes met in the dim light, and something passed between them then. Not shared pain. Not yet. But recognition. The quiet, brutal understanding of people who knew what it was to lose everything you loved in one bright, burning moment. At some point, midnight slipped past them. The cabin grew cooler. The girls didn't stir. Jack pulled an extra blanket from the hall closet and offered it to Elise. You can sleep here, he said, gesturing to the old pull-out couch. She hesitated. You sure? She asked. He gave a small nod. You're welcome. Both of you. She accepted the blanket with a kind of reverence, like it weighed more than wool. I won't stay long, she added quickly, her voice firmer than before. Just long enough to figure out where to go next. Jack didn't argue. He didn't offer advice, didn't ask about her plans. He just nodded and turned off the lamp. But as he lay in his own room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hush of rain and the creak of a stranger settling into his life, Jack couldn't help but wonder, what if she didn't leave? And why, for the first time in 6 years, didn't that thought terrify him? Jack hadn't stepped into that room in over 5 years. It had become something between a museum and a mausoleum. Door closed, curtains drawn, silence thick as dust. People said time softened things. They were wrong. Time didn't soften. It just learned to sit still. But that morning, as dawn broke gray and muted over Winford Hollow, Jack found the door cracked open. He froze. The hallway was dim, lit only by the pale light seeping through a smudged window. His boots creaked softly on the wood floor as he moved closer. The door hadn't been like that the night before. He remembered clearly. He'd passed it on his way to bed, hand trailing the chipped paint out of habit. The door was never open. Inside, Elise knelt on the floor barefoot, her hair falling around her face as she folded one of the twins' sweaters. The girls sat nearby, building something out of wooden blocks. They were whispering to each other, giggling occasionally, unaware of the history layered beneath them. Jack's heart stopped. That was Emma's quilt on the bed, Emma's mobile still hanging above. Emma's name still carved faintly into the windowsill. He should have been angry, should have barked something, made her leave, told her this was private, sacred, off limits. But Elise didn't treat it like a stranger's room. She treated it like something gentle. She moved carefully, quietly, not to erase, but to belong without disturbing. She looked up when she noticed him standing in the doorway, not startled, not ashamed, just aware. I'm sorry, she said. They wandered in here this morning. I didn't know it was... Jack shook his head, his voice rough. It's okay. She looked at him for a long moment, then back at the room. It's beautiful, she said softly. Was it your daughter's? He nodded, jaw clenched. I can put everything back. No, he said quickly, too quickly. No, it's fine. The words hung between them, strange and foreign, but once spoken they settled. Jack stepped inside slowly, his feet moving over memories like bones beneath the floor. He crouched beside the twins. You girls building something? One of them, June, or Josie, he still couldn't tell, held up a crooked tower. A castle, she said. For our bunny. She's the queen. Of course, Jack said, his voice softer than he remembered it could be. Good place for a queen. Later, as the girls played outside with sticks and acorns, Elise stood in the hallway, arms crossed. I didn't mean to overstep, she said. It just... They wandered in, and I didn't want them to be alone in a space that felt forgotten. Jack looked at her, really looked. Most people wouldn't even notice, he said. That it feels that way, forgotten. She gave a small shrug. I know how it feels to be the forgotten thing in a room full of memory. He didn't ask what she meant, she didn't explain. But Jack felt something shift, a shared understanding neither of them had the words to name. They spent the afternoon cleaning the porch. It had started as a way to keep the kids busy, but by late morning Elise was sweeping pine needles while Jack pried loose boards from the railing. The rhythm of it felt easy. Not fast. Not perfect, just steady. The kind of work that didn't ask questions. Used to be, Jack said, pausing to wipe his brow. I thought if I fixed every board in this place it might feel new again. Elise leaned on the broom handle. Did it? He looked up at her. No, but it helped me breathe. She smiled faintly. That's enough sometimes. Jack nodded. The girls squealed in the background, chasing something imaginary through the tall grass. Their laughter filled the air like music too old to remember but too familiar to forget. That night, as they sat on the porch, Jack with a cup of lukewarm coffee, Elise with her knees tucked under her in one of the old rocking chairs, the silence between them felt different. Not empty. Not waiting. Just peaceful. You really don't mind us being here? She asked finally, her voice barely louder than the crickets. I don't, Jack said. Truth is, it's been quiet for too long. She turned to look at him, her face half lit by the porch light. They like you, she said, more than they like most people. Jack looked away, the words sticking in his throat. They're good kids. They've seen too much, Elise whispered. Lost too much. He hesitated, then said quietly, You too? Elise blinked slowly. I used to think it was safer not to feel anything, just survive. But now I see how much that cost. Them. Jack stared into the night. I know that cost. They didn't say anything more. They didn't need to. Because for the first time since fire took one life and spared another, Jack Whitaker didn't feel like a man guarding ashes. He felt like a man being invited to build again. The early light filtered through the trees in soft gold streaks, touching the cabin with a warmth the wood hadn't felt in years. Jack sat at the kitchen table, carving a groove into a block of cherry wood. The girls were outside gathering leaves in baskets, determined to build a squirrel castle, whatever that meant. He could hear them squealing through the open window, laughter that made something flutter in his chest. He was just smoothing the edge of the grain when he noticed Elise standing in the doorway. She was wrapped in his old flannel, one he'd forgotten still hung behind the door, her hair loose and unbrushed but her eyes impossibly clear. And tired. Always tired. You okay? Jack asked. She hesitated, then stepped into the room and sat across from him. For a long moment she said, Nothing. Just watched his hands work the knife. Finally, her voice came, low, tight. There's something I should tell you. Jack looked up, knife paused in mid-motion. He didn't say anything, just waited. Elise traced the rim of her coffee mug with a fingertip, not meeting his eyes. I didn't leave him, she said. Not at first, I tried to make it work. For the girls, for the sake of appearance, that was everything to his family image. Jack stayed still. He's from old money, she went on, her voice flat now. Legacy, control, rules. When I got pregnant with the twins, it was clear I wasn't part of the picture he wanted anymore. His father said I had overreached my station. Jack flinched at the phrase. He'd heard it before, spoken in different tones by different kinds of people. He told me if I stayed quiet, let them raise the girls their way, I could stay in the house. But I'd be watched. Controlled. Her eyes flicked to his, finally. I couldn't do it. Jack nodded slowly. So you left. She nodded too. I left everything. Money. Security, my name. He let the words settle. The weight of them heavy and sharp. You don't owe me that story, he said softly. I do, she replied. Because I'm in your home. Because my children are in your care. And because I've seen the way you look at me when I flinch at shadows. Jack looked down, hands curled around the block of wood like it might anchor him. "I wasn't judging you," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's what scared me." Later that day, while the girls napped in the sun-soaked loft, Jack found Elise standing alone in the living room, staring at the mantel. She was holding a framed photo, faded, simple, a little girl in overalls, laughing mid-spin, hair flying wild. The frame was blackened on one edge. Smoke-stained. "Her name was Emma?" Elise asked. Jack nodded from where he stood in the kitchen, heart tugging. 6 years old, loved mud, hated socks. Elise smiled, faintly. "She looks like she ruled the place." "She did." Elise turned, carefully setting the photo back in place. "What happened?" she asked, almost a whisper. Jack hesitated. Then came the words he hadn't said aloud in a long time. Faulty wiring. Backroom heater. It sparked in the middle of the night. His voice thinned. "I tried to get to her. The smoke, I couldn't see. My shoulder..." He broke off. "The roof gave in before I got to her door." Elise's eyes glistened. "I'm so sorry." Jack nodded, jaw tight. "Everyone said it wasn't my fault, but I still hear her crying some nights. Still think maybe if I'd gotten up sooner." Didn't finish. He didn't have to. Elise stepped closer, her movements gentle, like she knew how fragile a man's silence could be. "She would have known you tried," she said. He blinked hard. Trying wasn't enough. It was love. The words hit deep, deeper than he expected. He hadn't called it that in years. He hadn't let himself. That evening, Jack found Elise outside, arms wrapped around herself, standing beneath the fading gold of the maple trees. She didn't turn when he approached. "They're asking about school," she said quietly. "They want to stay, make friends, plant something." Jack stood beside her, eyes on the horizon. "Then maybe they should." Elise looked over. "And me?" Jack met her gaze, steady. "You've got roots, too. Even if you didn't mean to. Plant them here." The breeze stirred her hair. The air smelled of pine and early frost. Elise reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases. "I started writing to them," she said. "Letters, in case I couldn't stay, in case they needed to know who I was." She handed the paper to him. This was the first. Jack took it carefully, unfolding it with reverence. The handwriting was soft, curved. "Dear girls, if you ever wonder why we left, why we lived in borrowed rooms and wore second-hand shoes, it wasn't because you were a burden. It was because you were the only thing in this world worth starting over for." He folded the letter slowly. "They'll never wonder," Jack said. "Not if they see how you love them now." Elise didn't reply, but her eyes, those storm-colored eyes, said everything her mouth didn't know how to. And as the sky turned lavender behind the hills, Jack realized he was no longer afraid of what her presence meant. He was afraid of what it would mean to lose it. The days began to slip into each other like pages in a well-read book. Soft, familiar, and edged with something Jack hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It didn't come all at once. It came in small moments. In the steam of morning tea shared with Elise across the table. In the sound of the girls' feet pounding up and down the hallway. In the way the house no longer felt like a shell with echoes, but like something living, again. Jack hadn't planned on any of this. He hadn't meant to open his home, his life, or, God help him, his heart. But the quiet was different now. It didn't ache. It hummed. Elise moved through the cabin like someone rediscovering how to exist in stillness. She started folding laundry without being asked, lined up the girls' shoes by the door, rearranged the spice shelf and apologized afterward, even though Jack hadn't minded. She cooked when she could, sat on the porch when she couldn't. Some mornings Jack would find her staring out the window with her hands around a mug, her gaze far away but not absent. When she noticed him watching, she would smile, just a hint, like she wasn't ready for full joy yet but willing to try it on. And Jack found himself lingering, in doorways, in thoughts, in places he used to rush past. The girls took to the rhythm of rural life like they'd been waiting for it. Josie was the louder one, always asking questions, always dragging sticks and leaves into the house as treasures. June was quieter, more watchful, prone to curling against Jack's side during stories like she was listening with more than her ears. They followed him everywhere, to the shed, to the garden, even to the woodshop out back, where Jack had started, sanding down a cracked tabletop just to keep busy. They called him Uncle Jack so naturally it felt like a name he'd carried all his life. One afternoon, he let them help him repaint the mailbox. By the end, it was covered in uneven brushstrokes, glitter stickers, and one crooked but determined heart. He left it exactly as they made it. Sometimes, he told Elise later, imperfection's the part that makes something last. She looked at the mailbox, then at him, and didn't say anything. But her eyes softened in that way he was starting to crave. The town began to notice. Winford Hollow was small, and quiet things got louder there over time. People noticed when Elise began shopping at the local co-op. When Jack started appearing with two little girls clinging to his hands, nobody said anything unkind. Not really. Old Sheriff Dale gave him a knowing nod. Mrs. Kepler from the bakery slipped 2 extra muffins in Elise's bag one morning with a wink. And Arthur Boyd, the retired carpenter who only spoke in sentences carved from sawdust and scripture, dropped off a bundle of maple planks without comment. "Looks like you're building again," he said, then drove off before Jack could answer. It wasn't a question. It was a blessing. That week, Jack and Elise rebuilt the front steps together. It had been years since he'd let someone into his rhythm, let alone someone with such a steady hand. Elise measured twice before each cut, squinted at the level like it owed her an apology, and asked more questions than Jack was used to. But he didn't mind. He liked the way she rolled up her sleeves, the way she wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, the way she smiled, not for show, but from surprise, when something actually worked. By the end of the day, they had a new step, a few blisters, and 2 giggling girls who'd been assigned tool-passing duty and took the role more seriously than most elected officials. "Think it'll hold?" Elise asked, tapping the finished plank with her boot. Jack looked down, then at her. "Yeah," he said, "I think it will." He wasn't talking about the step. That night, after the girls had been tucked in and the dishes were drying on the rack, Elise stood in the doorway of the living room, watching Jack by the fire. He was carving again, just a scrap of wood in his hands, a simple shape forming. She stepped closer. "What is it?" she asked. Jack turned it toward her. It was a bird, not polished, not smooth, but delicate, intentional. "I used to carve these for Emma," he said, his voice quiet. "One for every birthday." Elise touched the edge of the wing with her finger. "It's beautiful." He looked up, and for a moment the fire caught her face just right. She wasn't perfect. She looked tired, worn, but her eyes held something Jack hadn't seen in years. Hope, maybe, or the beginnings of it. He cleared his throat. "If you want, I could carve something for them, for the girls." Elise nodded, the smallest smile forming. "They'd like that," she said. "So would I." Outside, the wind had stilled. Inside, the air glowed warm. And for the first time in years, the house felt like it wasn't holding its breath anymore. It was breathing. The wind changed on a Tuesday. It wasn't the kind of change Jack could measure, with weather vanes or broken branches. It was quieter than that. A shift in pressure, a tension in the pine trees, a silence that sat too still. He felt it before he saw anything. The girls were laughing in the yard, tossing handfuls of amber leaves at each other. Elise knelt in the garden, her hands muddy and bare, pulling out the last stubborn roots of summer. It should have been a peaceful afternoon. But Jack had lived long enough to know that peace rarely stays when you start to believe you deserve it. The first sign was a car, not a local truck, not an old sedan with rusted sides and a hay bale in the back. This was sleek, black, city-plated. It slowed as it passed the cabin, crawling like a predator tracing familiar prey. Jack stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed, shoulders square. The driver didn't wave, didn't stop, just rolled by, windows tinted, engine quiet. Elise didn't notice, but Jack did. He watched it disappear down the road and felt the old weight settle on his chest again, the one he used to carry like armor, back when his world had just gone quiet and survival was all he could manage. That night he didn't mention the car. Elise had made soup. The girls insisted on setting the table, dropping silverware with little shrieks of giggles. Jack couldn't bring himself to sour the moment, but he checked the locks twice before bed, sat on the porch longer than usual, listened for footsteps in the gravel long after the fire had gone out. The next morning, a letter arrived. No return address. No salutation. Just one line in slanted, confident script. You're harboring what doesn't belong to you. It wasn't signed. Jack stared at it for a long time, the paper soft between his fingers. His jaw clenched. His thumb ran across the edge once, twice. Then he folded it slowly and slipped it into the pocket of his coat. He waited until the girls were down for their nap, and Elise was sitting at the kitchen table folding laundry, her hair tucked behind one ear, a smudge of dirt still on her sleeve from the garden. "Elise," he said, voice lower than usual. She looked up. Her face didn't register fear yet, but Jack could see it trying to break through. "I need to ask," he continued. "Is there anyone looking for you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Elise stared at him for a long moment. Her hand stopped moving. "Yes," she said. Jack nodded once quietly. He pulled the letter from his coat, unfolded it, and placed it on the table. She read it in silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, she began to shake. "He knows," she whispered. "Your husband?" She closed her eyes. Ex. Technically. Though his lawyers delayed everything. He was always better at power than love. Jack sat across from her. "He sent someone." She nodded. "He never wanted custody. He didn't even want children. But after I left, he realized they were leverage, a way to keep me in line or punish me." Jack leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the wood grain. "And now he wants them back." Elise's voice cracked. "He doesn't want them. He wants control. He wants to remind me that no matter where I run, he still decides how the story ends." Jack looked at her then, really looked, and saw something in her he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not even anger. Resolve. "I'll take them and go," she said, breath unsteady. "Tonight. I won't let him touch this house. I won't. Bring that into your life." Jack stood up slowly. "No," he said. Elise's eyes widened. "You don't understand." "Yes, I do." His voice was steady now, firmer than it had been in years. "You think the only way to survive is to keep running. I used to think that too, until I realized I'd run so far I didn't know what I'd lost." Elise opened her mouth, but no words came. He stepped closer. "I know what it means to lose a child. I know what it means to live with that hole in your chest. And I know that those two girls don't just belong to you." She blinked, stunned. "They belong here now, and so do you." Her lips trembled. "Jack, if I have to stand on the porch every night until that man gets bored or brave enough to show his face, so be it. But if he comes for you..." Jack's voice softened, but his eyes burned. "He goes through me first." A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it, didn't try to explain it away. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't practiced. She fit awkwardly against his chest, her body trembling, breath catching. But Jack held her like he'd held her daughters in that fire, without question, without condition. The porch light flickered outside. A breeze stirred the curtains, and somewhere in the yard, the first leaf of winter fell. The cold came early that evening, the kind of cold that stung your teeth and slid beneath coats and doors, like it belonged there. Jack felt it in his joints as he stacked firewood on the porch. He'd fixed the latch on the gate that morning, replaced a cracked window pane in the back room, and pulled out an old space heater just in case. He didn't like the way the wind moved, didn't like the way the shadows stretched longer than they should have, didn't like the silence that had settled over the property, too still, too waiting. Inside, the girls were reading by flashlight under a blanket fort. Elise was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred a pot of something that smelled like rosemary and warmth. For a moment, Jack let himself stand at the doorway and just look, at her, at all of it. And he thought, if this is a dream, let it last just one night longer. The knock came at 9:12 p.m. 3 hard raps, then nothing. Jack was up before the sound had finished echoing. Elise stood frozen, spoon mid-air. He held a hand up. Wait, and stepped out onto the porch. No one there. But something else was smoke, thin, sour, not the clean kind from a hearth, the dangerous kind, the kind that made your skin remember everything it tried to forget. Jack turned. His heart stopped. The side of the cabin, the old shed, was glowing orange. Then the flames leapt. Elise! He roared, bolting through the front door. She was already grabbing the girls, shouting their names, wrapping them in coats with trembling hands. The lights flickered, then died, leaving only the wavering orange outside to guide them. Take them to the truck, Jack shouted, pointing toward the driveway. Don't wait, just go. But now. Smoke was pushing in through the back windows, black and angry. Jack grabbed the fire extinguisher, yanked open the back door, and was hit by a wave of heat that stole his breath. He tried anyway, sprayed the shed. Useless. It had caught too fast. Accelerant. Someone had meant for it to burn. The flames licked the eaves, crawled toward the kitchen wall, then roared. Outside, Elise had buckled the girls into the back seat of Jack's truck, but she kept glancing back, panic rising, hands shaking. Jack burst through the front door again, coughing hard. He wiped his eyes and turned. Elise, is everyone? Her face went pale. Jack, she breathed. Where's Josie? The air left his lungs. She was with me, I thought. She ran back in. Her bunny. She left her bunny. Jack didn't wait, didn't think. He turned and plunged back into the cabin. The hallway was already filled with smoke, the air hot and thick like swallowing ash. The walls creaked and groaned with old wood and angry fire. Josie, he shouted, stumbling forward, hand outstretched. A faint cry answered him, from the back bedroom, the one with the stars on the ceiling Elise had painted 3 weeks ago. He found her crouched by the dresser, clutching a half-melted stuffed rabbit, eyes wide with terror. The flames danced in the hallway behind him. It's okay, Jack said, hoarse. I've got you. He lifted her into his arms. She clung to his neck, sobbing into his shoulder, his scarred one. The one that hadn't carried weight in years, now it did. He moved fast, half blind, trusting memory over sight. The roof above them hissed, cracked, then collapsed, right behind them. He didn't stop, didn't slow. He broke through the front door just as the wall behind them fell inward, with a furious groan. Elise was screaming, then running, then crying as Jack stumbled into the night with Josie still wrapped in his arms. He collapsed to his knees beside the truck, the cold dirt wet beneath him. Josie was crying. Elise was crying. Jack couldn't tell if he was crying too. She knelt beside him, cupping his face, checking his arms, his skin. I thought, I'm okay, he rasped, barely audible. She's okay. He passed Josie into her arms, watched, as she kissed the girl's soot-streaked forehead again and again, whispering her name like a prayer. Then Elise turned back to him, her hands on his face, her eyes full of something not quite broken. I thought I couldn't feel anything anymore, she said, trembling. I thought I'd lost that part of me. Jack blinked smoke from his eyes. You didn't. She leaned in, forehead resting against his, and then came the words, soft, fragile, raw. I thought I couldn't love again. Jack swallowed hard. His voice broke. I thought I couldn't either. She kissed him. Not like the end of a fairy tale, like a promise whispered through smoke and ash. Behind them, the cabin burned. But in the firelight, they didn't run this time. They stayed. Morning arrived without color. The cabin was gone. Jack stood where the porch used to be, his boots sinking, slightly into damp, blackened earth. The air still carried the bitter scent of smoke and wet ash. The fire had devoured everything except the stone chimney and a warped horseshoe that somehow remained nailed above the back door frame. What was left of it? What was once home was now hushed ruin. He didn't speak. He just stood there, still, like the ashes might whisper if he waited long enough. Behind him, Elise wrapped her coat tighter around her and checked on the girls, who slept curled together in the bed of Jack's truck, their faces smudged, cheeks red from the cold. They hadn't said much since the fire, just held on to each other and their mother like the world might disappear if they let go. Jack glanced back at them, then down at his own hands, blistered in places, still trembling. He didn't feel brave. He felt empty and heavier than anything he'd carried out of that burning house. They spent that first day at Tobias Boyd's barn. The old carpenter didn't ask questions, just waved them in before sunrise, cleared out a corner of the hayloft, and brought in thick blankets from his truck. I seen fire take more than homes, he'd said as he lit the iron stove. But if you're lucky, it leaves behind what matters. Jack hadn't known what to say to that. Maybe he still didn't. By the second day, the girls were asking questions. Where's our bookshelf? Is my bunny burned now? Can we go home tomorrow? Elise answered as best she could, her voice soft and slow, never saying no, just not yet. She kept them warm, kept them close, braided their hair with ash still trapped near the scalp. Jack watched her quietly, noticed how she held herself differently now, straighter, steadier. There was a steel in her spine that hadn't been there weeks ago. She was surviving again. But this time she wasn't doing it alone. On the third day, Jack collapsed. Not with drama. Just folded. He had been walking the edge of the burned foundation, trying to salvage what was left. A hinge, a cracked mug, a half-melted photo frame. Then suddenly the world tilted sideways and his knees gave out. He hit the ground with a grunt, hands to his chest. Elise was there in seconds, kneeling beside him. Jack, what is it? Just winded, he said, but his voice shook. Your hands are ice. He tried to sit up. Failed. His breath was shallow now. His lips tinged gray. Elise's face twisted in panic. Stay still, just don't move, okay? She ran for Tobias. Jack watched the sky blur above him. The clouds moving too fast. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of leaving like this. Afraid of leaving her. Of leaving them. The town doctor came by noon. A woman with a kind face and calm hands. You're lucky, she told Jack after a quick exam. Mild smoke inhalation, exhaustion, some dehydration, and I suspect a heart that's taken more grief than rest. Jack winced. Not the first time someone said that. Well, she smiled, packing her bag. Let's make sure it's not the last either. Elise walked her to the truck. Jack stayed behind with a warm blanket over his shoulders, a mug of broth in his lap, and a guilt he couldn't swallow. She came back 10 minutes later and sat beside him on the hay bale. You scared me, she said simply. I scared myself. You can't do that again. Jack looked over at her. I didn't go back in for heroics. I went back because I couldn't lose another child in fire. Her lips parted. Her eyes welled. But she didn't. Cry, I know, she said. They sat in silence for a while. Then Elise reached over and took his hand. She didn't squeeze, didn't speak, just held it, like her presence alone could steady the beat inside his chest. And somehow it did. That night, the girls insisted on sleeping next to Jack, one on each side. Elise pulled their blankets tighter, placed a tiny flashlight in their hands and kissed their foreheads one by one. Jack lay on the cot with their heads resting against his arms. It was uncomfortable, cramped. His ribs ached, but his heart had never felt more full. He didn't sleep much. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to miss the feeling. Near dawn, Elise stood at the barn's entrance, looking out toward the hills. Jack joined her, wrapping his coat tighter against the wind. They stood shoulder to shoulder, neither speaking. Then softly, Elise said, "I thought when the house burned and that would be the end." Jack nodded. "I thought that the first time too." She turned toward him, her eyes clear now. "But it wasn't," she said. "No," Jack agreed. "It was the beginning." And from the edge of ruin, as the sky bloomed with the first golden threads of morning, Elise reached for his hand again, and Jack reached back, not out of reflex, not out of need, but out of choice. The ash had barely cooled when the first hammer rang out. It wasn't Jack's. It belonged to Arthur Boyd, who showed up with a flatbed truck and 3 crates of salvaged lumber. Said nothing, as usual, just set the crates down by the edge of the ruin and nodded once before disappearing into the early mist. By noon, Sheriff Dale arrived with a bag of nails and a case of canned stew. "I know I'm no carpenter," he grumbled, handing Jack a thermos of coffee. "But I'm decent with a level and better with a shovel." Jack didn't ask how they knew. He didn't need to. Winford Hollow had eyes that didn't pry, but hearts that always paid attention. By the second day, the site had a name, not an address, not a deed. Just a name, carved into a piece of driftwood Josie had found on the riverbank and painted with glitter and crooked letters, "Still House." "Because it's still our house," June explained, climbing onto Jack's lap with flecks of sawdust in her hair. Jack pressed a kiss to the top of her head and held on a little longer than necessary. Rebuilding began in rhythms. Elise laid out sketches with trembling hands. She had never designed anything before, but Jack could see it in her. Clarity through chaos, steady lines where most people saw only wreckage. They worked side by side, pausing to chase children, stir soup, sweep wind-blown leaves. Jack taught her how to brace a beam. She taught him how to not measure everything twice when it came to decorating the girls' new room. They argued once, over window placement. They laughed twice, once when June tried to paint the cat, and again when the roof tarp collapsed mid-rainstorm and soaked Sheriff Dale head to boots. There were no blueprints, just memory. And intention. People came. Not in crowds, but in quiet, persistent trickles. Mrs. Kepler brought curtains and cinnamon. Tom Murphy brought a generator and a hug that said more than words could. 3 teenagers Jack didn't recognize showed up with wheelbarrows and left with calluses and smiles. No one asked why he stayed. No one asked why she stayed. They simply did what good people in small towns do. They made space. On the 5th morning, Jack woke early and walked out to the garden plot. The frost had kissed the edges of the grass, but beneath it, green shoots had begun to rise. The promise tree, as Elise had called it, stood near the porch, a young maple they'd planted together, exactly where the old front steps had been. Its leaves had mostly fallen now, but one single red one clung stubbornly to a branch. Jack touched the bark. It didn't look like much, but it would grow. That afternoon, as the final railing of the new porch went in, Jack stood back and looked at it, not just the wood or the steps or the doorframe, but the light, the way it slanted across the boards, the way it spilled out of the windows. There was nothing temporary about it. Behind him, he heard the creak of footsteps. Elise. She was barefoot, hair braided back, one of the girl's drawings tucked under her arm. "You built it," she said softly, looking out at the porch. Jack shook his head. "We built it." Her eyes met his. "We did, didn't we?" He didn't answer out loud, just held her gaze. That was enough. At dinner, the girls lit candles and declared it was housewarming night. Josie wore a paper crown. June gave a speech about porches being better than castles. Jack gave each of them a hand-carved wooden bird. And Elise? Elise stood in the middle of the room, her eyes wide, hands at her heart. and said, "I never thought I'd have a place I didn't have to run from." Jack stepped beside her. His hand found hers like it belonged there. "You don't." Later, after the girls had drifted to sleep under quilts that smelled of cedar and hope, Elise and Jack sat on the porch beneath the stars. The wind was light, the world quiet. The house behind them pulsed with warmth. Jack turned to her. "I never thought I'd stand on this porch again," he said. Elise leaned her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd get to build one." They sat like that until the chill crept too close. Then she took his hand and they went inside. And for the first time since the first fire, since the silence, since the loss, since the fear, Jack closed the door behind them and didn't feel the need to look back. Spring came to Winford Hollow like a secret passed hand to hand. Snow melted in quiet creeks. Tree limbs shook off winter in little shivers. And the promise tree, once a slender branch in frost, stood taller now, dotted with tiny green buds that caught the light like little lanterns. Jack watched it every morning from the new porch, coffee in hand, blanket over his knees, the girls still asleep behind the windows. It had been nearly 5 months since the fire, 5 months since everything burned again, 5 months since Elise stayed, and each day still surprised him. Not because it was perfect. There were arguments about vegetables, school permission slips, laundry, but because it was his, theirs, real. The house breathed now. It creaked in different places than the old one had. The walls smelled of sawdust and cinnamon. There were fingerprints on every windowsill. One cabinet never quite closed all the way. A wooden bird hung near the kitchen window where it spun in the breeze, crooked but steady. Maisie came by after school some afternoons to read to the twins. Sheriff Dale dropped off seeds for the garden. Elise started working part-time at the local clinic, tending to bruises and coughs with the same quiet care she had used to rebuild her own life. And Jack had started carving again. Not just birds, but small things. A dollhouse, a wooden bridge for the toy train, a tiny door for the girls' fairy garden. He wasn't fixing the past. He was building the now. One Saturday morning, Jack sat at the porch steps while Josie tugged at his sleeve, holding a dandelion crown she had woven herself. "Is this good enough to wear to a wedding?" she asked. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Whose wedding?" "Yours," June answered from behind her sister as if it were obvious. Elise laughed from the doorway, a dish towel in her hands. "Is there something I should know?" Jack flushed. "I mean, I don't have a tux." Josie handed him the crown anyway. "You don't need one. You just need to say yes." Elise crossed the porch. Her eyes caught his, soft and steady. "I didn't come here looking for a husband," she said. Jack nodded, heart full. "I didn't rescue those girls looking for a family." They stood close then. The wind shifted. The porch light buzzed softly behind them. "But maybe," Elise whispered, "that fire didn't take something. Maybe it gave something back." Jack reached for her hand. "I don't need a ceremony," he said, voice low. "Just this porch, this tree, this light, this day." Elise smiled. "The kind that started small and grew until it reached everything. Then let's keep choosing this," she said. "Every day." Later that evening, after the sun had slid behind the hills and the porch creaked with stories and bare feet, Elise sat beside Jack beneath the maple tree. The girls chased fireflies across the yard, their laughter echoing off the trees. Jack held Elise's hand, fingers warm beneath the twilight. "You remember the night I brought them out of that fire?" he asked. She nodded. "I thought that was the bravest thing I'd ever done." "It was," she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "No, the bravest thing was letting myself stay." She rested her head on his shoulder, the fireflies blinking like tiny stars in the grass. "And what about tomorrow?" she asked. Jack smiled. "We stay again." That night, after stories and teeth brushing and giggles under blankets, Jack stepped out onto the porch one last time. The promise tree rustled in the wind. A single wind chime whispered in the dark. Elise joined him. Barefoot. Quiet. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of every choice that had led them here. Jack took a deep breath, his chest rising, his heart calm. Behind them, the house was glowing. Not with fire, but with life. And as the night settled in, Jack whispered to no one in particular, or maybe to the stars, maybe to the wind, maybe to Emma, something that had lived in him for years and finally had words, "We're home." If this story touched your heart, stay a little longer. Because some stories aren't about escaping the fire. They're about learning to plant something new after the smoke clears, and choosing, again and again, to stay. Some stories end in fire. This one ended in light. Not because it was easy, but because someone stayed. He didn't mean to become their hero. She didn't plan to find home. But in the ashes, they built something no flame could touch. If this story found you, if it stirred something quiet inside your heart, we'd love to have you here. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us, where every story is a step toward healing. Because sometimes family isn't where you begin, it's where you're brave enough to stay.